before we bring Ed Feng onto the show, just to remind our listeners about that promo code over at DSI Sportsbook, BTV and the number 25. Get you a $25 free bet just for signing up. 100% deposit match bonus for the sportsbook. 100% deposit match bonus for the live casino as well. Keep in mind that you want as many outs as possible when it comes to the Super Bowl and the prop betting market. Some sportsbooks are going to be off by a few yards. You're going to have different juice at every sportsbook. So head on over to BangTheBook.com. Check out our sportsbook reviews. See which one of those offshores works for you. And obviously, if you're out there in Las Vegas, use those apps to your advantage. See what the different lines are. Head out, go down to the brick and mortars, check out what they have available, and listen to Brian's show as well, because I'm sure he'll be talking about a lot of those things with those different sportsbook directors. One more guest here on this Tuesday edition of the show. That is Ed Feng from the Power Rank. Ed, how's it going today, man?
It's great. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm doing very well. Appreciate your time here on this Tuesday morning show. And let's go ahead and start things off by talking about Super Bowl 52. As I mentioned in that previous segment there with Brian, a lot of the 5.5s in the offshore market have gone down to 5. Not a particularly significant move with a number like this, but I think we're starting to get a little bit of an indication here on what the sharper side may be in this game.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the other side here. I feel like I feel like it's a little bit. We were discussing what the line should be, watching Philadelphia just roll over Minnesota, and I kind of threw out a number of 7. And we've seen, the model go away. We've seen the markets go away from that number, and this just strikes me as an overreaction to 2 great games that Nick Foles has had. He's played incredible. And I guess, the markets didn't really move. I mean, it seemed like my number compared to the market has been a 5-point adjustment with Philly's kind of full season numbers. So the adjustment to Nick Foles was about 5 points each of the last 2 weeks. And I feel like everyone's completely forgotten about that, because now all of a sudden we have a situation in which it's a lot less. We kind of expect Nick Foles to go into the Super Bowl and continue what he's doing. I have my doubts about whether that is going to happen. We saw Cam Newton have 2 incredible playoff games a couple years ago. And I feel like it's a lot of the same situation. Then he went into the Super Bowl against Denver, really struggled. Now Denver's defense is much better than what New England's going to put out there. But I also think Cam Newton's a lot better than Nick Foles. So, I've been hearing a lot of stuff about the sharp side being Philadelphia, and I'm not sure I agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either. I was kind of talking with my boss yesterday, and I sort of expected this number to kind of climb back up to where the look-ahead lines were, because you mentioned you thought 7 would be a number that you were kind of looking at. The look-ahead lines were 6.5 and 7 out there, depending on where you look. And, New England didn't play all that well against Jacksonville, and like I just mentioned in that previous segment, if Jacksonville doesn't go conservative in the fourth quarter, we're probably talking about the Jaguars being in the Super Bowl. But they ran on every first down, threw a bunch of deep shots on second down for no good reason, and Warren Sharp's done a fantastic job breaking that down on his Twitter account at @SharpFootball. And again, it's one of those things where I don't know why coaches do this year after year after year. So you could say that New England maybe got a little bit fortunate, and to be fair, Tom Brady made plays in the fourth quarter, and Tom Brady always does that.
He so did.
Yeah, and Philadelphia won 38-7 in a game where they were a 3-point dog. So there does seem to be a bit of an overreaction here, which is interesting to me, because I have to think that the books know they're getting a lot of New England public money. I feel like from a sharp standpoint, I think they may be a little bit more split than what this line is suggesting.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. I think I expect this line to go up. But by the time we get to next Saturday, Sunday morning, I think it's going to go up. And it's kind of a weird thing, if usually New England is going to get the benefit of the doubt in this kind of game. But just with the situation of struggling to beat Jacksonville and the way Philly played, it's kind of the exact opposite. Maybe a little bit similar to, the Alabama-Georgia national championship game, where the Goliath of the league is kind of limping. I don't even want to say limping, but haven't necessarily played their best football in recent games, and we're seeing the markets account for that in a pretty dramatic way.
Well, and I think another thing too that we haven't talked about yet, and I'm kind of surprised we haven't, because we've had 2 days here worth of Super Bowl analysis on the show, and we'll have a ton of it as we continue to go forward, specifically looking at props here later in the week and next week. But Philadelphia was catching, 3.5 on the opener to Minnesota at home in the playoffs. You figure that's a full 3 at least worth of home field advantage. So on a neutral, Minnesota minus 6-ish, minus 6.5, something like that. Same thing with Atlanta in the divisional round. Why is New England only laying 5? Because New England is better than those two teams as far as I'm concerned.
I hear you, man. You're making my argument for me. And, I think this is even more apparent in the total. I think the total is 48 right now. My numbers put it at about 49.5. Obviously, very good offense with New England. Good defense with Philly, but you expect Brady to get it done, especially if he has Gronk back. And, we discussed kind of on a 5-point adjustment for Carson Wentz and Nick Foles. So we're seeing a lot of optimism for this Philly offense, and I kind of get it just the way that Foles has really played the last 2 weeks. I mean, he's been fantastic. I mean, you can't say enough about what he did against a very, very good Minnesota defense. But, we always, the Super Bowl is about the most public of public games as far as the sports betting markets go, and I think we're seeing a lot of effects there.
I just, everything I think about in terms of digging into this line, I just have a harder time figuring it out. I mean, like you said, I thought the 6.5, 7 was a pretty good number, and I don't want to read too much into what I saw in the conference championship round. I mean, for New England, obviously they did struggle with Jacksonville, and New England has struggled a little bit in some of their bigger playoff games here. I mean, let's keep in mind, they won 34-28 last year, but they were down 28-3, as everybody knows full well now. And I apologize for Falcons fans that are listening here that have to relive this whole thing here over the next 2 weeks. But it's not like they played well early in that game. Atlanta got conservative, let them back in the game, and then they're inexplicably throwing when they should be running, late in the fourth quarter. Jacksonville let New England win that game pretty much. If Jacksonville keeps going, keeps putting that gas pedal down on the floor, we are talking about a different type of Super Bowl matchup here, I think. So I get that. I get sort of the pessimism about New England in that regard. But like you said, there seems to be a significant amount of optimism for this Philadelphia team, for Nick Foles. And that sort of segues into the next point that I want to talk about here is that we've got 2 weeks now. So you've got New England with the chance to get Rob Gronkowski as healthy as possible. You've got Philadelphia with the chance to work some more things in for Nick Foles. But the fact that Philadelphia systematically dismantled Minnesota last week gives high marks to Doug Peterson, to Frank Reich, to John DeFilippo, to Jim Schwartz. I wonder how big New England's coaching advantage actually is in this Super Bowl.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give the edge to Belichick in this. I mean, all due respect to Peterson, I mean, he's done fantastic this year, bringing along a second-year quarterback. Making him look like a future Hall of Famer. I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. But Belichick has gotten it done for a long, long time. I kind of believe in him, and we know that he's willing to stretch the interpretation of every rule as well. And I still I'm gonna side with the New England coaching staff in this matchup.
All right, so let me ask you about this. You're largely a numbers-based guy. I mean, it's not to say that you don't incorporate, situational handicapping and some of the intangible things into what you come up with and your thoughts on a game. But from the numbers standpoint, you mentioned that you think that New England, I mean, was that like a raw number for you of 7, or was that, taking into consideration as well that New England's been here, done that, that they're going to be the public side here, which generally tends to be a little bit shaded. But what's a raw number look like for you on this game?
Yeah. So I threw out the number of 7, and then what I did after the game was I tried to use the markets to figure out what they would project forward. So I basically eliminated all the games with Carson Wentz from Philadelphia, and I took 4 games. So the 2 in the regular season that Nick Foles started against the Giants and Oakland. I threw out the last week against Dallas because they weren't playing for anything, and I think the markets reflected that. And then I put in the 2 playoff games as well. So you kind of have 4 games in which you can kind of get a market-based adjustment. New England, all the data is in there. And for most every other team, all the data is in there from the markets. I run that through my algorithm to kind of adjust for strength of schedule and to project forward what the market should say about the Super Bowl. And it comes out to 7. I mean, 6.8. And that's kind of what I guessed before, and pretty happy. That's kind of what I thought the market would be. And that's why I'm really I'm intrigued by this kind of 2-point jump down to 5 and really staying there for a couple of days now. Yeah, it fascinates me.
And this is such a unique element and such a unique game because, I mean, it's almost like the bowl games in that the lines are just sitting out there forever. And you kind of get waves of action. You'll get that initial movement. If people think there's value on that opening line, then it'll kind of sit there. Maybe you get some adjustments for suspensions or injuries or coaching changes, coordinator changes in college, what have you. Here, though, you have this unique element where this line sits up here for basically 2 full weeks. And obviously we had to look at headlines that you could consider beforehand as well. You get a little bit of initial market movement. You'll kind of see something here, I think, the middle of the week. And then you sort of see moves coincide with when limits are increased. Once we get to game week, limits will go up. Limits will go up again middle of the week. And then by the time we get to kickoff, I mean, books are going to be taking obscene amounts of money on this game. So what's really challenging about an element like this is that this line sits out here. Shows like mine, I know you do a podcast, mainstream media, everybody's talking about every single element of the Super Bowl. By the time you get to the actual game itself, it's almost paralysis by overanalysis because you've considered every possible factor. So that's something that's really challenging, I think, about the Super Bowl is that if you don't like a position early on, if you feel like there's not something that you've found right out of the gates, then you may start to nitpick a little bit or sort of be influenced by one thing that's something of an outlier. And that's what's challenging here about this game is that we have 4 data points for Nick Foles. We have, 14 seasons for Tom Brady. So I feel like there's a little bit of an unknown element on the Philadelphia side, and I don't really know how to quantify that and how to factor that in, not just for the side and total on this game, but then obviously for the props, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, I talked to Cade Massey, who runs Massey Peabody. I think this was before Philadelphia and Atlanta. And he was talking about, we have a model. We try to do some stuff with quarterbacks, and we have a number for every quarterback in the league. And, we take Carson Wentz's number and subtract Nick Foles' number, and we get an adjustment. And after he said that, it was really interesting because he said, well, I don't really trust the number, so I'm not even going to give you my prediction for that. And I think that just goes to show you, even with all the data that we have, I mean, the NFL is a lot easier than college. You have no prayer making a quantitative adjustment for a backup freshman quarterback in college football. You're just going with what you see or what you know and anything else you have. In the NFL, we can do a little bit better, but even the experts out there that try to do this don't necessarily trust the number. And, I think that's where we're seeing this market going because we've seen Nick Foles, and he's been good, and that's pushing this thing towards Philly.
All right, so let's talk about it from a prop standpoint then. And I know that as you and I were talking before the show, you haven't dug too much into the prop market here as of yet, and I'm sure you'll do that as we get closer to the game. It can be a little bit of an uncomfortable situation for somebody like you that relies a lot on the numbers, on the data, because you kind of have to do some guessing. You kind of have to put yourself in the mind of the offensive coordinator and say, who are they going to focus on? What do they feel like is going to be a significant mismatch for them? Because that with 2 weeks to prepare, theoretically speaking, the opposition should take away your best player as much as they possibly can. Then you mix in the Nick Foles thing that we already talked about where you really don't know quite what you're going to get from him. I mean, he has played well in the 2 playoff games. Statistically, he's played better than the eye test showed if you consider the first game. Then this past game, he was very, very good against Minnesota. If you go 10 of 14 against a historically good third down defense, that's really, really remarkable. So what is the approach for you in terms of trying to organize your prop thoughts and look for some of the edges that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, I try to take a numbers-based approach just to get a baseline. Obviously, you mentioned all the adjustments that you want to do, but if you're looking at receptions, a baseline is, how many receptions per game that player has caught. I mean, I think you can get a good baseline for what Gronk is going to do. You can look at some of the analysis, and then above and beyond that, you want to look at analysis that other people do. The DFS people know a lot about how a defense defends a tight end. I talked to Evan Silva about that on my podcast last week, and he knew that just how these defenses defend tight ends and how they defend running backs, and you just want to combine that all together. And but of course, it's definitely one of those things where you want to put your knowledge of watching games in as well because that's really important.
And it's something that I've had success with in terms of sort of isolating that wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 4 type guy that, a team winds up using, especially when you've got a guy as cerebral as Tom Brady, or you think about if a guy like Drew Brees would have been in this situation. You've got these guys that can go through their progressions, trust all the guys that are out there, and, they're not going to have to rely on that number 1 wide receiver and force feed him the ball with 14 or 15 targets. It's nice to have a situation like that. And you kind of have that with Philadelphia where, Foles doesn't have a number 1 guy because he hasn't really played enough to have one. Ertz probably is
right.
that guy for him. But, he's got a lot of skill position talent he can spread it around to. So, I think this is a really complex Super Bowl, and all of them should be because there's so much scrutiny and so much of a spotlight for these games. But especially when you consider the situations for these two teams, when you consider that New England, kind of struggled with Jacksonville, and Philadelphia's defense, while it wasn't the best in the league like Jacksonville's was, Philadelphia's is pretty damn good too, and they've got 2 weeks to prepare for this game. So, it's just fascinating to look at the overall catalog of everything that's out there. And, Ed, is it almost too much for you? Because you're compiling so much data, you're trying to find all of those edges that are out there. Does it become a little bit too overwhelming?
I mean, yeah, I think it certainly can, especially when you do have this 2 weeks. I feel like, Adam, you know what it's like to be working in this industry, and I feel like with a week to prepare for a set of games, it seems really quick. And then now we get to the playoffs, and we got one game over 2 weeks, and yeah, I think you can definitely overthink things. I just try to stick to basics. You talked about the Philly pass defense. I have them 5th in my adjusted yards per attempt. This is a really good unit, relatively healthy. And, Brady did better against an even better unit in Jacksonville last week. But I think Philadelphia's going to put up some resistance. Brady's hand looked pretty good. So in that game, it didn't look like he had any issues with that. So I see a really good matchup on that side of the ball.
Last thing I want to ask you about with the Super Bowl, then we'll transition over to college hoops to finish things up here. And I posed this question to Brian Blessing, and I'm going to pose it to all the handicappers and sports personalities that I have here on the show. This game is indoors. It is up in Minneapolis, and I'm sure it'll be cold for all the fans that are walking around and the players that are walking around and all that. But it is inside, so weather will not be a factor. In your mind, Ed, does that benefit one side more than another, or does that just benefit everybody as a whole?
Yeah, I kind of think it benefits everyone as a whole. You're indoors, essentially room temperature. It's a lot of like going south for a bowl game, and everyone in the Midwest is going to complain about how these Big Ten teams have to go out to the Rose Bowl, and it's not a disadvantage. I don't know. I don't believe in any of that stuff. I think it's a pretty neutral site, and I really like it too because I don't have to make any wind adjustments for my totals prediction. So yeah, I don't know if it faces. Maybe if you had a dome team like in Atlanta playing New England, that's an outdoor cold weather type team, maybe that would affect it. But these two teams play in outdoor stadiums. They play on the Eastern Seaboard, reasonably close to each other. So, yeah, I think it's a wash playing in a dome in Minneapolis.
All right, let's transition over to college basketball here for a few minutes, which is something that a lot of people are going to be doing now with the NFL wrapping up. And we've got technically 2 games. I'm going to put an asterisk next to that because I don't think anything in the Pro Bowl coming up this weekend. So we've got the Super Bowl, and then the next big thing is March Madness. So you're going to have a lot of people sort of transitioning over to the college basketball side of things. And Ed, we have a lot of data points on these teams already. So for those that are just now getting a head start in college basketball, they're certainly behind quite a bit. As far as what we talked about last week, we talked about some teams in terms of looking to, establish some futures value on them, some teams that, we kind of looked at in terms of having a good chance to, make some noise in the month of March. And yet, once again, you look back at last weekend, or you look back 2 weekends ago, last weekend, even last night, top 10, top 15, top 20 teams just continue to show that we just really don't have that many elite teams this year.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. We talked about futures a week ago, and we talked about I mentioned that some years you have 5 teams that can win the NCAA tournament. I think this year it's going to be closer to 10. I think it makes it just that much more exciting in terms of watching the game. I think it's that much more exciting in terms of winning NCAA pools. I don't know if it affects betting spreads or totals, but for definitely the common fan, it's definitely a good thing.
I think it's really frustrating on a game-by-game basis. And, I think one of the hardest things, and I tell our listeners this all the time, is that when you're handicapping a game, my goal, both with what we talk about on this show and also within my personal handicapping or the stuff I write over at BangTheBook.com, is I try to limit variance as much as possible, because you're never going to take all of it out of the equation. You just try to get in your mind how you expect this game to go. You try to account for a lot of the angles that are out there. And right now in college basketball, I mean, it just feels like, with the frequency of ranked teams going down, it's just a really high variance environment right now. And I think that's something that can get a lot of people in trouble as they make that transition over to college hoops, not knowing a whole lot, about what we've seen so far and what the current, the current landscape is in the market.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's been, more over the last 2 weeks that we've seen those upsets. I don't really think that should affect your handicapping at all. I mean, if you're betting these games, you kind of have your take on these teams, and don't let one game kind of talk you out of what you thought about this team. For example, Michigan just looked awful against Nebraska last week. Just played their worst game. Probably fluke. Came back just fine against Rutgers on Sunday. Did what they had to do. I still think it's an interesting team. We don't know exactly how good this team is, but don't let one game or a couple of upsets just affect your process. Does that make sense, Adam?
Yeah, well, that's been the hard part for me. I mean, I'm a big-time baseball guy. I'm a big believer in sabermetrics, as I mentioned on the show here, and I'll be doing a lot of sabermetric analysis on the show once we get into spring training and all that type of thing. But when you look at baseball, a lot of it is predicated on larger sample sizes, and really a lot of data, statistical analysis, is predicated on larger sample sizes. And I've had that problem in the NBA, the NHL, and also college basketball this year, where the long-term sample sizes, that you have a certain expectation, but the variance levels are just so high. I mean, I'm finding at the NBA and the NHL much, much streakier than I ever thought about. College basketball, there's just not a ton of consistency here this year. So it's been really tough on me to look at things from a statistical standpoint, just because, it's almost kind of laughing in the face of everything that I've believed about statistical handicapping and statistical analysis.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with you. And maybe we can talk about a particular game to kind of show maybe my perspective on it. Kansas is at Oklahoma tonight. I do team rankings, and they take margin of victory in games and adjust for strength of schedule. And so that's your typical kind of analytics-based handicapping, right? Oklahoma is predicted to win by 3. But when I do my best predictions, that's not the only thing I use. I use some market-based data as well, and I even use some data from the preseason polls. It turns out that the preseason polls is a great wisdom of crowds estimator of college basketball team strength. Predicts some, I think, 71, 72% of tournament game winners. So that's all the way at the end of the season. And I actually use that as well. And when I put everything together, I actually get that Oklahoma should win tonight by about 1, which is right where the markets are, which is a little bit off from where kind of the numbers-based handicapping would say, Oklahoma's been a better team this year. And I think that what it tells you is that Kansas has probably underperformed a little bit this year, and we can expect them maybe going forward. They have more talent than what they've shown in the numbers. And that's what makes numbers-based handicapping hard, especially, college basketball is definitely hard, even with the 20 games that we have now. It is really, really hard with college football. So I hope maybe that gives you some perspective on, just kind of the numbers-based thing. Don't necessarily throw it out, but just kind of take it with a grain of salt. It's definitely one thing that you should use, and I'm a numbers guy, and I fully believe in it too. But when I do my full analysis, there's other factors that come in, and you can kind of see that. It's been really fun to look at some of these numbers today and just see that the full ensemble, so the group of predictors that I use, is much closer to the markets, and I think much closer to what's actually going to happen tonight.
Maybe this just has something to do with the fact of, the manner in which I follow all these leagues, all these teams, that type of thing, from doing the show and making sure that I have a wide knowledge base. But it's something that I've kind of noticed over the last few years. And it was something where last year I did not have a good baseball season because a lot of the things that I've traditionally done just didn't work out. And I didn't adapt quickly enough. I was handicapping starting pitchers too much when they were having so much less of an impact on individual games. So you're constantly adapting. You're constantly evolving. Sometimes in college athletics, I sort of attribute it to the talent pool being a little bit more spread out, with all the social media and technology and all the things that are out there nowadays. Kids are playing in different places than they used to play. You used to have these big college recruiting powerhouses, and now you're going to get some 4- and 5-star kids that go play at FAU or go play at, Wake Forest or North Carolina State instead of going to play in the SEC. So, it's been really hard for me in terms of finding that good balance of, I like the numbers-based approach. I like the quantifiable stuff. I like some things that can eliminate kind of those gray areas that look a little bit more black and white. But I've had to make a lot of adaptations and a lot of changes here to the way in which I handicap these leagues. Have you felt that you've had to put in, whether it's more controls or more considerations over the last 3-4 years?
Not necessarily more controls. Like I would definitely say that, I'm always trying to look at what my model doesn't capture. And I think that's really important whenever you're trying to use numbers. Numbers are a great baseline. Numbers do not capture everything in the same way that markets don't capture everything. And that's the reason we do this, right? Because there are inefficiencies. I think maybe I've been using kind of more of the subjective analysis of trying to figure out where my model is wrong as I've dug into it. I'm not sure that necessarily has to do with just the last 4 years, but more of kind of my evolution, looking at markets and betting on games and things like that. I think I have done that more. And I will continue to, because I think that's a really important part of making predictions and knowing where your model is wrong and then making the proper adjustments. And I think when you look at sports bettors, like I've talked to a lot of people in a lot of fields, and the one thing I love about this industry is that people change. People are willing to improve and get better, and I think that's really the goal of life, really, in every area, right? Change, get better, improve, and I think when you do something like bet on sports games, you are forced to do that, and I think that's a good thing.
Let me ask you about a game here tonight, and we'll sort of try to illustrate some more of these handicapping type concepts with the numbers. And that's game 525, 526. Clemson takes on Virginia. Big one here in the ACC. Virginia opened a 9-point favorite. We're up to 9.5, pretty much market wide. Big injury for Clemson here with Dante Grantham going down. Torn ACL. He's done for the year. He was their second leading scorer. So, this is a really unique situation, because you'll have the situational handicappers saying, well, you're playing Virginia. You're going to have a very limited number of possessions. One of your best offensive players is gone. It's going to be really hard for you. You're going to have other situational handicappers saying Dante Grantham's out. First, real legitimate test without him. Everybody else is going to step up. Clemson's going to be highly motivated. They're a team you want to back tonight. So you have, two very different schools of thought. And then there's trying to figure out how much does the loss of Dante Grantham actually mean to Clemson? Would this number have been 8? Would this number have been 8.5? You try to quantify what his absence means. So walk us through that process for you here on an individual game basis with a situation like this where Clemson plays, a top defensive team missing its second leading scorer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you start out by saying, well, what would the markets have said if everyone would have been healthy in this game? And the way I do that is I take past closing point spreads, run it through my algorithm to adjust for strength of schedule, and then it spits out a number at me with home court and everything. And that number is 7.5. So my metrics would say the market should be at 7.5 if everyone were healthy. So that suggests that, Grantham's a 2-point adjustment. And that's how I start my analysis. If you really want to do this right, you're going to know how, who his backup is, how the shots get distributed, who's going to take more shots, whether that player is efficient, whether that player has the talent to keep that efficiency with a higher workload. So that's how I would approach something like that.
And I think what's interesting, too, is you also have to factor in that this game has a total of 119.5. It opened 118.5, went down to 117. Now it's gone back up. So in that respect, too, again, limited number of possessions, lower scoring game. Then you have to determine what Grantham means in a spot like that with a low total, as opposed to if this was your run-of-the-mill game with a total of, 138 or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely, because Virginia's going to walk the ball up the court. They're going to play stingy defense. That's what Tony Bennett does. And, I think that's a tough one. Efficiencies and pace don't really correlate that well in college basketball. So maybe you can use that to say, okay, well, we expect most of the things to be the same, for that Clemson offense. But, things can really change when you're missing a key player.
Let me ask you about one more handicapping scenario here, and then I'll let you go for today. Game 551, 552. Duke takes on Wake Forest. Duke opened a 9.5-point favorite. They're up to a 10-point favorite now. But this is kind of your quintessential look-ahead type of spot. They just blew out Pitt, had no issues with the Panthers over the weekend after a nice road win in Miami. They play Virginia coming up here on Saturday. They'll host them at Cameron Indoor. So you have this spot here where you would expect that there's a chance that Duke comes out, doesn't play particularly well with this look ahead, but also you can put yourself in a really dangerous position if you incorporate that too much into your handicap and then, wind up with a number that's really not indicative of where it should be. So what do you do in terms of situations like that? Do you really factor that in at all? Is it one of those things where, maybe you need the overlay to be a little bit higher to play the game? How do you approach those, look ahead, let down types of situations?
Yeah, I think in this situation, I'm not too particularly concerned about Virginia on Saturday. My best number for this game is about 9.3. So that's, again, with the numbers and then with a little bit of the preseason expectations and what we think this talent's at, I think that number's about right. I think it would be a little different if they were playing North Carolina on a Thursday, if that makes sense. I think Virginia's a big game, but I don't think it's anything like a huge rivalry like another game would be. So I would actually kind of de-emphasize the situational angle in that game.
All right, well, so that's an interesting thing to me because, is it fair to say that, you only incorporate it when you really think it's relevant as opposed to, kind of throwing it in there almost just to be safe rather than sorry?
Yeah, I tend to, so me personally, if I saw a bunch of data that on these types of letdown games, I'd probably be more likely to emphasize it, without having seen that data. And if you just rely on me to use what I know about college basketball to figure out if this is a situation, I don't know. I guess I'm just not particularly excited about it because Coach K is kind of that, he's the motivator, right? I mean, he's the guy that gets these guys up for every game. He's the guy that can get the team to obliterate a bad team by 45 and not let them slack off in this game. So just from college basketball knowledge, I just don't think it's just not a huge thing to me in this particular situation.
No, and that's interesting. And I don't know what the right answer is. I know what your answer is, and I know what my thoughts are on it. And I know that there are some other people out there that really handicap these situations heavily. But that's one of the things I love here about this industry is that you can have people that have success in a variety of different ways. And truth be told, I don't know what the answer is. And not only that, I don't know how much it should be factored in. If there is any kind of situation, is it worth a half a point? Is it worth a point? Does that really change, the way that you're going to handicap or bet the game? I don't know. That's something that I'm still trying to figure out, something that I'm still trying to, come to terms with, because like I said, what I like about baseball is that I've got the black and the white. I've got the numbers. I've got what the predictive value is of them, and that's what I go with. I don't feel as comfortable doing that in other sports, and, sometimes being outside of that comfort zone can be a challenging thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just pointed out what makes these betting markets so efficient. I mean, we all have our points of view about what's important about a game, whether it's a numbers guy, whether it's a situational bettor. And the reason the markets are usually pretty efficient is that the kind of the aggregation, the wisdom of that crowd is going to get that number right. And, I just think you just bring a good point of why, these markets are pretty good, especially, and they're going to get better in college basketball over the next couple of weeks, just because people know so much now.
No, that's true. And also it's going to be interesting to see, some of that public money that we started off this little bit of the segment about, because you've got people that are going to be betting college basketball just to bet it because it's out there because there's no football anymore.
Right.
And that's going to have to be accounted for in the marketplace as well. So, we had Kyle Hunter on the show yesterday, talked about how underdogs have been very profitable in January and February in the past. So that may be something that our listeners want to keep an eye on here over the next few weeks. But Ed Feng from the Power Rank, what do you have going on over there right now, man?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've actually written a booklet about passing versus rushing in the NFL, and it kind of answers the question how New England could make the Super Bowl with the 31st worst rush defense in terms of yards allowed per carry. It answers the question, why Adrian Peterson had to beg for a free agent contract this past season. Be happy to send you a copy if you sign up for my free email list, and you can learn more about that at thepowerrank.com. It's all one word, /booklet.
And you can also follow Ed on Twitter @thepowerrank, no spaces, no underscores, anything like that. Ed, appreciate your time on today's show. Thank you so much for joining us, man. And hopefully we'll talk to you again real soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much for having me on.